Imagine taking a cactus, right? Like an incredibly resilient plant. One that's literally spent thousands of years evolving just to survive months without a single drop of rain.
Right, it's completely armored.
Exactly, armored. It hoards its own water. It builds these sharp spikes to protect its reserves. Now imagine taking that highly specialized survivor, ripping it completely out of the desert, and planting it directly into a flooded, overflowing wetland.
It would just, well, it would drown.
Yeah. What happens is the very mechanisms that kept it alive in the desert become its absolute undoing. It rots from the inside out, destroyed by an environment of excess it was just never built for.
That is such a devastating image of biological displacement. And, when you apply that exact image to the human psyche, specifically the psychology of the immigrant experience, you get what I think is one of the most viscerally accurate metaphors for cultural dislocation we've ever encountered.
Seriously. And welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Today, we are bringing you, yes, you listening right now, into a text that doesn't just, politely ask for your attention. It absolutely demands your critical engagement.
It really does. We're looking at a poetry collection that operates exactly like that drowning cactus. It's bristling with defenses, it's entirely out of its element, and it's kind of suffering under the weight of its own survival instincts.
The book is called Through and Through, A Lustful Silhouette. It was published in 2020 by Nirasha Gunasekera. And before we unpack even a single line of verse, we have to establish the ground under our feet here.
Right. The context is vital.
Yeah. So Gunasekera is a male, Sri Lankan-born immigrant. He's currently living and working in Melbourne, Australia. And he actually makes his living as a software engineer.
Which is fascinating, right? Because he lives in this highly logical, structured, arguably sterile world of coding by day, yet he's forging this profound literary identity in his mother tongue, writing in Sinhala by night.
It's a massive duality. And this isn't some tentative debut either. This is his 5th poetry collection. He's been publishing since 2004. So we are dealing with a mature, established poetic voice.
But a voice that is broadcasting from a state of multifaceted displacement. Hemispheres, languages, modes of thinking, it's all fractured.
Exactly. And our objective for this deep dive is to put that specific duality under a microscope. We're going to sequentially analyze the first 15 poems of this collection. But to be very clear, we aren't just here to summarize what these poems are quote-unquote about.
No, absolutely not. We are here to ruthlessly evaluate Gunasekera's craft. We need to interrogate his word economy. We have to ask if the structural intelligence of these poems can actually hold the immense emotional weight they're carrying.
Right, because I want to know if the tension we feel on the page is just like raw, bleeding instinct, or if it's the product of really refined, disciplined technique, or maybe it's where those two things collide and just fracture.
That tension is where the real analysis lies. Because raw emotion is powerful, obviously, but raw emotion does not automatically equate to masterful poetry. Is that vulnerability meticulously sculpted, or is it just spilling out chaotically?
And reading this, I'll admit, I was struck by how uncomfortably vulnerable it is. Like you almost feel voyeuristic reading it.
Which is precisely why we have to be rigorous. We're going to apply some theoretical lenses here. Psychoanalysis, phenomenology, affect theory, not to just throw academic jargon around, but to really stress test the structural integrity of the work.
If a poem is truly great, it can survive that stress test. So let's get into it. And to do that, we actually had to start before the poetry even begins.
The paratext?
Yeah, the preface and the dedication.
Yeah.
Because he does something super interesting in his preface. He spends an entire section basically writing about his own hesitation to write. He talks about this 3-year gap between his previous book and this 2020 release, and he blames it on what he calls a writing arrears.
I love that phrase, writing arrears. It's a brilliant piece of economic vocabulary applied directly to creative output.
It really is.
He describes enduring this barrage of crises, the onset of COVID-19, a sudden job loss, and just the sheer exhausting mechanics of trying to survive as an immigrant in a foreign country during a global shutdown. He's essentially saying the business of staying alive bankrupted his ability to create.
I think anyone listening can relate to that feeling of pandemic burnout, right? That sense that you owe a debt to your own potential, but your emotional bank account is completely overdrawn.
Exactly. Life just keeps issuing fees you can't pay.
Yeah. But what really fascinated me was his attitude toward publication itself.
Okay.
He tells the reader that he absolutely refused to publish any of these new poems on social media or even in newspapers before the physical book was released.
Yes, and his reasoning for that embargo is highly revealing. He claims he withheld the work to protect his original phrases and metaphors from being stolen by unskilled readers and writers lurking online. He actually uses the word patent. He wanted to preserve the patent of his own vocabulary.
Okay, let's unpack that, because my first instinct was actually to respect it. Like, we live in an era where we just endlessly scroll, right?
Yeah.
We consume a beautifully crafted thought on a tiny screen, we swipe past it, and we forget it instantly.
You think it's a noble stance?
I do. By refusing to feed his work into that algorithm, he's forcing the reader to encounter it in its pure, intended form. He's saying, if you want this, you have to sit down with the physical book and give me your actual attention.
That is a very charitable interpretation.
Yeah.
But if we view this through an ontological lens, meaning the philosophical study of being and existence, we really have to ask what it means for language to exist in the modern world. Can you really own language like a physical patent?
I mean, you own the arrangement of it, right?
Sure, but by hoarding his vocabulary and locking it away from the collaborative nature of modern communication, he might be revealing a deeply insecure, defensive posture. It suggests this very old-school modernist anxiety about the sole genius creator whose precious thoughts might get tainted by the unwashed masses.
Okay, yeah, when you phrase it like that, it does sound a bit elitist, like he's guarding the crown jewels from the peasants.
Exactly. And more importantly, it sets an impossibly high critical bar for the work itself. If you're going to stand up and say, my metaphors are so profoundly original that I must lock them in a vault, then when you finally open that vault, those words had better be flawless.
That's a totally fair point.
Mhm.
If you claim to be a master jeweler, the diamonds better not be glass. And the very first thing we pull out of that vault is the dedication, brought to a wetland, planted, and causing pain to a cactus tree.
Which serves as the master key for the entire collection. When we apply diaspora theory here, looking at populations dispersed from their homelands, the cactus metaphor is incredibly precise.
Right, because the cactus represents the immigrant who survived harsh, arid conditions back home. They develop tough skin.
Yes, and then they're transplanted to a wetland, a wealthy nation like Australia, characterized by economic excess and totally different social norms.
And the tragic irony is that the wetland isn't attacking the cactus. The wetland is just being a wetland. It's the cactus's own survival mechanisms that are killing it, the inability to process all that foreign input. It perfectly primes the reader for a landscape of profound psychological discomfort. We aren't reading about smooth integration. We're reading about someone quietly drowning.
And that internal drowning becomes immediately apparent as we move into the first poem, On a Jungle Path in the Heart. The speaker describes walking and suddenly encountering a woman dressed entirely in pure white.
Now, for context for the listener, in Sri Lankan culture, a woman dressed in pure white carries very heavy connotations. It's deeply associated with visiting the temple, with purity, with offering flowers. It's a visual shorthand for sanctity.
Right. But the moment the speaker sees her, he admits to having an inexplicably impure thought. And he describes wrestling with this thought as if he's physically taming a wild beast or a panicked horse thrashing around.
It's so cinematic. But let's look at it through psychoanalysis.
Yes, specifically the tension between repressed primal desires and the socially acceptable personas we wear. Here we see the classic intrusion of the male gaze. The gaze isn't neutral here, it's an act of psychological violation. It takes this image of religious purity and instantly soils it with sudden desire.
The contrast in the diction is wild.
Mhm.
You have the stillness of the blinding white temple garments clashing directly with the kinetic violence of wild beasts.
Huh.
But here is where I want to challenge the craft.
Go ahead.
He spends all this time describing the violent struggle to suppress the thought, but he never actually tells us what the impure thought is. He just vaguely calls it impure. Is that a deliberate, crafted choice to create a productive silence? Or is it just a vague cop-out? If I don't know the thought, how can I feel the weight of his guilt?
That right there is the essential dividing line between masterful poetry and amateur verse, the difference between crafted ambiguity and accidental vagueness.
Right.
In this specific instance, I'd argue it demonstrates technical control. By refusing to specify the thought, the poet ensures the focus remains entirely on the mechanics of repression, rather than the object of desire. It's not about what he wanted to do to her, it's about the exhausting internal violence required not to think about it.
Okay, I see that.
However, from a critical perspective, relying on such stark binaries, the pure, static female figure versus dark, wild male desire leans dangerously close to cliché. The word economy is tight, but the conceptual foundation is a bit predictable. predictable.
Yeah, it relies on tropes we've definitely seen before. But if you want to talk about throwing tropes out the window and getting hyper-specific, we have to look at poem 2, A Bloody Mary Burning.
A massive tonal shift.
Huge. We shift from this mythological jungle path directly into the harsh reality of the morning after a casual encounter. The speaker is looking out the window, watching mountain goats and birds, while experiencing this creeping regret about a conversation that started over a Bloody Mary the night before.
This is a phenomenal opportunity to apply phenomenology.
Okay, let's break down phenomenology really quick for anyone who didn't spend 4 years in a philosophy seminar. Basically, it's not concerned with what an object objectively is. It's the study of how that object appears to our consciousness, how we subjectively experience it.
Precisely. So in the context of this poem, it's not about the medical reality of alcohol in the bloodstream. It's about the sensory nightmare of the hangover. The hangover is experienced as the agonizing brightness of the sun and the erratic movements of the animals outside.
The external world just becomes a mirror for his internal nausea. And the metaphor he uses at the end is, in my opinion, a stroke of absolute genius.
The celery stalk.
Yes. He says he wishes he could take the memory of this woman and the whole night and discard it, just like the celery stalk of a Bloody Mary. Think about how brilliant that is. A celery stalk in a cocktail is this bizarre, aggressive, completely mundane object.
It provides no nourishment.
Right. It's stringy, it's bitter, it doesn't get you drunk, it's totally superfluous. You chew on it mindlessly and then throw it away in disgust. He's comparing the entirety of human intimacy to a piece of garbage garnish. That is staggering wordcraft.
The celery stalk metaphor is indeed a triumph of original language. It strips away all romance. However, if we evaluate the poem holistically, we have to scrutinize the pacing leading up to it. The poem lingers extensively on the imagery of the Bloody Mary itself, the red color, the burning spice.
You think it's too much?
I must ask, does this extended lingering risk becoming indulgent? Does the repetition of the red, burning imagery obscure the emotional core and make the poem structurally bloated?
Oh, I completely disagree that it's bloated. I think the form perfectly mirrors the function. Think about what it actually feels like to be hungover and filled with regret. Your brain doesn't move forward logically.
It loops.
Exactly. It gets stuck on loops. You sit there with a headache going, why did I drink that? It was so red. Why did I say that? It burned my throat. The slight indulgence in the descriptive language perfectly captures that inescapable, sluggish mental state. He's trapped in the loop of the Bloody Mary.
That is a very robust defense of the poet's structural intelligence. If the repetition is a conscious mimicking of a cognitive loop, then it represents a high degree of technical mastery. And that sense of being trapped transitions seamlessly into poem 3, midway on the journey.
Where he's trapped in his own routine. He's observing a woman smoking at a window in a brick building during his morning commute. And then hours later, during his evening commute, he sees her in the exact same spot.
Which brings up a core symptom of urban voyeurism. Why are we so deeply fascinated by strangers framed in windows?
It's so true. If you've ever walked down a city street at night, you look up, you see a silhouette pouring water, and you instantly start writing a movie script for them in your head. You assume their life is either incredibly romantic or deeply tragic.
And that voyeurism is a byproduct of modern existential alienation. We feel disconnected from the masses, so we force artificial connections by projecting narratives onto silent figures at a distance. The shifting subjectivity here is fascinating. The speaker projects this massive narrative of loneliness onto her, assuming her stillness equates to tragedy.
Right. He's looking up thinking, oh, this poor, lonely woman waiting all day. Meanwhile, she's probably just having a cigarette break while working from home. He is taking his own profound isolation and draping it over her like a heavy blanket.
So the critical question regarding craft is this, does Gunasekera demonstrate intentional control over this voyeuristic distance? Is the poet aware that the speaker is a highly unreliable narrator? Or is the poet himself indulging in the tired cliche of the mysterious, tragic city woman?
I really believe the awareness is baked into the structure. By bookending it with his morning and evening commutes, he's highlighting his own routine. It subtly reveals that he is the one obsessively checking the window. The tragedy isn't hers, it's his.
If that reading holds, it shows very sophisticated manipulation of distance. But as we move forward, that comfortable voyeuristic distance collapses. We leave the safety of the street and confront the terrifying proximity of intimate relationships in Section 3.
Yeah, we move from public stasis to private, devastating marital distance. Let's look at poem 4, Her Own Moment. It's incredibly simple, like a photograph. A woman sits entirely still on a decayed wooden bench in the mountains. The wind is blowing her hair.
And the speaker realizes she must not be disturbed.
Exactly. He describes her meditative state as a fragile crown resting on her head.
This poem is a masterclass in pacing and the deliberate architecture of silence on the page. The structural intelligence here lies entirely in restraint. Gunasekera utilizes spacing and conceptual pauses to build a metaphorical cathedral of quiet around this woman.
It's all about what is left unsaid. Think about how often we see someone we love being quiet, and we just demand to know what they're thinking. What's wrong? Talk to me. We intrude. But here, the speaker honors her right to be completely impenetrable. It's profound reverence.
And that quiet reverence contrasts violently with Poem 5. The extinguishing itself is a turbulence. The setting shifts to a chaotic, rain-soaked crowd. A sudden downpour has everyone rushing for cover. But amidst this frenzy, one woman stands perfectly still in the rain.
And her stillness causes a massive, chaotic reaction in the speaker's own mind. This is where we see affect theory operating at full capacity.
Affect theory dealing with precognitive bodily responses.
Right, those visceral gut-level responses. The writing is so instinctive. The juxtaposition of the frantic crowd against her static energy, it creates a friction that bypasses logic entirely.
The imagery is kinetic, certainly. But as critics, we have to interrogate the originality of the language. The concept of the still point in a turning world, the one calm person in a panic, is a heavily trodden poetic motif. Does Gunasekera generate truly new expressions here, or is he just relying on the sheer sensory volume of the rain to do the heavy lifting?
Is it a cover song, basically?
Precisely. The word economy is tight, but is the core image novel.
I'd argue the novelty doesn't come from the external image, from the internal subversion of expectation. Usually, seeing someone peaceful in a storm is a calming image. But for this speaker, her stillness brings turbulence. It agitates him. That inversion elevates it beyond cliché.
That's a fair point regarding the psychological inversion.
But speaking of turbulence, we have to talk about Poem 6, The Most Difficult Seasons. Because this poem takes us behind closed doors, and it's brutal to read.
It is a forensic dissection of a relationship experiencing thermal death. The couple sleeps back-to-back in the dark. Gunasekera uses the chilling phrase mechanical intimacy. They've retreated into separate dream worlds, lacking even the caloric energy to argue. They just listen to the mindless weather report on TV.
Reading this through the lens of masculinity studies looking at male emotional paralysis, it is devastatingly authentic. The stoicism has fully metastasized into emotional rigor mortis. He describes the distance between them as a literal brick wall being built right down the center of the bed.
And here is where our debate on craft must take center stage. You feel the authenticity, but as an analyst of technique, I have to push back on the brick wall metaphor. Is this language disciplined, or does it drift into lazy, exhausted tropes? Describing emotional distance as a brick wall in bed borders on soap opera dialogue.
Okay, yes, isolated on its own, the brick wall is a known quantity, I'll give you that. But I argue he earns the right to use that cliché because of the hyper-specific details surrounding it, specifically the weather report.
How does the weather report save the metaphor?
Think about the function of small talk. The weather is the ultimate safe topic for people who have fundamentally run out of big talk. The juxtaposition is brilliant. They're staring at a screen telling them about the external climate, the precipitation, while completely ignoring the catastrophic freeze taking over the internal climate of their marriage.
That is an incredibly sharp defense. By contrasting the televised objective data with the subjective silent horror, he rescues the poem from its own cliché. That demonstrates high structural intelligence.
But it leaves the speaker in terrifying stasis. When human connection fails that fundamentally, where does a displaced mind turn?
Which brings us to the next thematic movement, escaping the human entirely, turning to nature, machinery, and the hyper-present moment. In Poem 7, A World Beyond Words, the speaker is at the mangroves with drunken friends. They are engaged in loud, bloated chatter. He turns away and watches thousands of seagulls swooping in a silent, coordinated dance over the water.
This poem is a pristine example of word economy. He compresses the complex action of the birds into this tight imagery of a silent dance, contrasting massively with the sloppy, grammatically loose dialogue of his friends. The birds communicate perfectly without a single word. The humans possess endless vocabulary and communicate absolutely nothing.
The structural pacing mimics the subject perfectly. But in Poem 8, On a Highway in the Morning, that natural escape is replaced by a mechanical trap. He's stuck in misty morning traffic, looking into adjacent cars, seeing parallel, isolated lives. He specifically notices a girl laughing at a digital screen in the back seat of her parents' car.
This is a profound study in existential fragmentation. The traffic jam is the ultimate modern symbol of alienation. You're surrounded by thousands of people, separated by inches of glass moving the same way, but you're profoundly alone.
And the detail of the girl laughing at the screen elevates it. It's double-layered alienation. She's mentally isolated from her own family, immersed in a digital simulation. The speaker is watching a ghost looking at a ghost.
We're raising a generation isolated within our own isolation.
The craftsmanship here lies in visual control. Notice the cinematic panning. The poem moves from the wide shot of the mist, pans to the metal, pushes through the glass, focuses on the screen, and rests on the reflection of her laugh. That directs the reader's eye with the precision of a camera lens.
And that intense feeling of being trapped leads to a massive psychological breakthrough in Poem 9 right in this instant. The speaker is alone, and he decides to just open a rare, expensive bottle of Bordeaux wine he's been saving. He realizes the perfect moment with friends is a toxic myth and consumes it in radical, solitary presence.
Philosophically, this acts as the structural pivot for the entire collection. Up to this point, the speaker has been defined by longing, voyeuristic projection, and alienation. A passive observer, but with the physical action of uncorking the bottle, we see agency. He stops waiting for life to happen to him.
I really want to connect this directly to you, the listener, because how often do we do this? You buy a beautiful candle and never burn it because today isn't special enough. Or the fine china gathers dust. We constantly defer our own joy to a hypothetical future. This poem is a violent rejection of that deferral.
Structurally, the placement is a masterstroke. Transitioning from the sprawling dread of the highway to the hyper-specific sensory reality of tasting Bordeaux alone, the poet demonstrates immense technical control over the emotional trajectory. He's actively composing an arc.
But just as you start to relax, Gunasekera rips the rug out from under us. We move into section 5, poems dealing heavily with eroticism, objectification, and the male gaze. The language becomes overwhelmingly saturated.
Saturated is the exact word. Let's critically examine poem 10, A Picture Story. The speaker is looking through physical photographs of a woman. Some show her rough, dishwashing hands. Another shows her in a bathtub with wine, red rose petals, and a red light. The poem heavily emphasizes his male hands holding these photos, collapsing her complex life into a 2D object.
Okay, I know we're going to have a massive fight about this poem.
We absolutely must. Evaluating this through feminist theory requires a severe critique. This is a textbook example of the male gaze and objectification. The woman is fragmented, rough hands, a body in a tub. Her narrative is literally held hostage in his hands. Does the poet recognize this problematic framing, or is the speaker unironically indulging in it?
I am going to vigorously defend his intent here. I do not believe this is unironic indulgence. I think you have to read it as a self-aware tragedy of reduction. Look at the mechanics. He's holding the photos, realizing how pathetic it is to think holding paper means possessing her.
You see it as a confession.
Yes. Think of a butterfly pinned under glass. The collector preserves its beauty, but the act of pinning it kills it. The contrast between her rough hands of the rose petal bath proves he knows she's complex. But the photograph forces her into two dimensions. The tragedy is that his hands are framing the story, and he knows his frame is inadequate.
If we accept that premise, that it's a deliberate confession of inadequacy, then the ambiguity is a crafted, productive silence. It forces the reader to evaluate their own complicity in viewing images. However, I maintain my critique of the imagery itself. The red light, the rose petals, they feel incredibly predictable. Structurally weak cinematic cliches, it borders on pastiche.
I hear that. But poem 11 proves his capability for unique nuance. White frangipani flowers. The speaker crushes a frangipani flower in his hand, and the scent triggers an overwhelming memory of a faded face on an island thousands of miles away.
A brilliant intersection of diaspora theory and sensory embodiment. The olfactory bulb is neurologically next to the amygdala, which processes memory. Smell is biologically the closest sense to time travel. The crushed flower bridges the gap between Melbourne and Sri Lanka.
But notice the craft in the action. He doesn't gently smell it. He crushes it. He commits violence to release the scent. That physical violence mirrors the agonizing pain of diasporic longing. You have to hurt yourself to remember home.
A beautiful breakdown of the mechanics. And that lack of restraint explodes in poem 12, the title poem. Through and through a lustful silhouette. The setting is a dark bar with burlesque dancers, red lights, and a hyper-focus on the physical bodies, specifically using the term Toblerone tunnel to describe a thigh gap.
And this is where we debate erotic language as craft.
Yes. Does the poet express desire with nuance and restraint, or does it risk excess and predictability? We can't ignore the recurring motifs piling up. Distant women, recurring red lights, the paralyzed observer. The poet risks circling the exact same emotional ground without advancing the psychological insight.
This is where I think his raw talent benefits from a complete lack of editorial restraint. Using a hyper-modern, frankly vulgar internet slang term like Toblerone Tunnel in a Sinhala lyric poem is a massive, audacious flex.
A flex or just a lack of discipline?
It shows fearless willingness to use ugly, beautiful contemporary language. He isn't dressing his lust in classical terms or comparing legs to marble columns. He's putting his desire under harsh neon lighting exactly as it exists in a dirty modern bar. It's crass, but undeniably honest.
I concede it's a deeply jarring diction choice that jolts the reader. But jarring the reader doesn't automatically equate to disciplined craft. Shock value can mask a lack of deeper metaphorical evolution. Is the desire complex or merely graphic observation?
I'd argue the complexity exists in what immediately follows it. The structure of the book itself provides the complexity. Because we move from the neon-lit physical lust directly into Section 6, poems 13 to 15, we go straight into the suppressed, agonizing quiet of familial restriction. The whiplash is intentional.
The tonal shift is indeed violent. Let's examine poem 13 with a half heart and a faint smile. The perspective shifts back to Sri Lanka. An aging father reads a newspaper in his armchair. He gets a call from his emigrated children and meticulously hides his crushing sadness behind a faint smile on the newspaper pages.
This poem completely broke my heart. If we want to talk about the power of what is left unsaid, this is the pinnacle. The emotional restraint is devastating. You have a father and son separated by oceans, both engaging in this theatrical performance, lying to protect the other from the burden of their grief.
This is where Gunasekera's structural intelligence shines brightest. Notice the control of the physical imagery. The newspaper isn't just a prop. It functions as a literal barrier, mirroring the geographic distance. He's using the words of strangers to physically block out the reality of his missing family. The word economy is incredibly precise here. No repetitive lingering, just the compression of immense sorrow.
So disciplined. And that theme of deep suppression carries into poem 14. Only the highway is with me. The speaker is on a summer train. He sees girls in short clothes, but heavily constrained by societal rules. He completely suppresses his physical reaction. He looks away, but mentally sculpts them like a potter. When they leave, he's left alone staring at the empty highway.
Viewing this through masculinity studies, we see the internal battleground between raw male desire and the constructed, civilized self. The potter metaphor is fascinating. He isn't just remembering, he's actively recreating them in his mind, sublimating his repression into a space where he possesses total control. He's making art out of his own denial.
But the tragedy is how empty the ending is. The art isn't real. It vanishes when they step off the train. He's left staring at the asphalt. The highway is the ultimate symbol of transit, endless forward motion without a destination.
Which perfectly sets up the synthesis of this first arc in poem 15, in a silent domain. A noisy flock of birds settles into a dark tree, becoming eerily silent like a static charcoal drawing. Suddenly they fly away, and the poet describes their departure as leaving a literal scratch on the observer's heart.
A scratch on the heart. It's such a tiny injury, but it stings. It irritates you long after the event is over.
The technical rhythm here is masterful. The line structure mimics the sudden silence, forcing the reader to pause. It poses a phenomenological question. Why do sudden absences affect our consciousness more violently than continuous noise? The birds were chaotic, but their sudden departure is what causes the physical pain. It flawlessly concludes the 15 pieces.
So, as we step back and evaluate his work as a whole, what's our final verdict on craft? We've scrutinized the tension between raw expressive force and technical ability. I think it's undeniable that his talent for capturing existential isolation and diasporic longing is profound. He hits nerves most of us try to keep buried.
I don't disagree with the power of his raw emotional talent. The resonance is real. However, from a strict critical standpoint, I must reiterate a structural limitation. The recurring motifs, silent female figures, red lighting, sudden weather changes can feel structurally repetitive. Tighter editorial control would have prevented emotional saturation from blunting its own impact. Sometimes less is more.
I hear that, but I'll offer a final counterargument. That repetition isn't a flaw. It mirrors the obsessive nature of memory. When you're fixated on a past you can't return to, your brain loops. You see the exact same red light in your dreams. The repetition is the literal architecture of obsession.
That is a remarkably thoughtful defense. And regardless of where a reader lands on technical efficiency, we must acknowledge this work's vital place in contemporary Sinhala literary discourse. As an immigrant writer, Gunasekera actively expands the boundaries of what Sinhala poetry can be. He injects a pastoral form with modern, technological, urban alienation.
Exactly. He brings in the digital screens, the traffic jams, the Bordeaux wine, the Toblerone tunnel. He refuses to let his native language exist as a polite museum piece. He drags it out into the rain and the dirty bars.
He negotiates his existence across massive divides and forces his poetry to do the exact same heavy lifting.
Which brings us back to the first image we talked about, holding a photograph, thinking you own the reality inside the frame. We've watched a speaker desperately trying to build frames around chaotic experiences.
Holding photos, sculpting memories, crushing flowers to invoke ghosts.
So I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought to mull over. Think about your own internal archive. When you look back at your own memories, especially the painful ones where you felt like that cactus in the wetland, are you curating them? Are you acting like the speaker in poem 10, holding the narrative tightly, choosing which parts are lit up and which stay hidden?
It is the most profound question of agency regarding our personal history. Who is holding the pen?
Exactly. Ask yourself, are you truly possessing your past? Or, by holding onto it with such a desperate grip, is your past actually possessing you?